Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the ICNA Endorsed Webmaster Series 2020. We have successfully completed 14 webinars and we have stepped into 15th one. And it's a quick recap of pediatric nephrology. And next few webinars, we are going to have glomerular disease-based discussion. Today, we have three eminent speakers, and Dr. Edwin Fernando will be chairing the session for the day. Dr. Edwin Fernando is the Professor Head of Nephrology and Renal Transplantation at the Government Stanley Medical College, and he's a Senior Consultant Nephrologist at Dr. Mehta Group of Hospital. Definitely, he's a guiding force for all of us during difficult times, and his area of interest is towards renal transplantation, acute kidney injury. He is also awardee of Award of Excellence by the Government of Tamil Nadu in 2018 and 2019. And he will be chairing the session for the day. And a kind request, we'll be receiving the questions in question and answer chat box. So you can drop your questions in that, and we'll be taking up the questions verbally towards the end of the session. Over to Dr. Edwin Fernando. So you can introduce the speakers.
Yes. The first talk of the day. The first talk of the day, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, the first talk of the day. Thank you, Dr. Kalaivani and Dr. Nammalwar, for taking this forward on a large scale. The first talk of the day will be done by Dr. Sudha, who's my colleague at Dr. Mehta's hospital. She's had 10 years of experience in pediatric nephrology after her undergraduation at the Kilpauk Medical College and post-graduation in pediatrics at the Kanchi Kamagoti Children's Hospital. She has done fellowship, ICNA fellowship, as well as the ISN and Tamil Nadu Dr. MGR Medical University fellowship. She conducts the NephKids CME program, which is well-renowned and attracts a lot of delegates among the postgraduates and other consultants. This she's been doing for the past 5 years. And she's one of the leading names of in pediatric nephrology. She's been on various committees and subcommittees drawing up guidelines. And today she will talk on what is known as what was earlier known as post-infectious glomerulonephritis, now renamed as infection-related glomerulonephritis. What was thought to be a very benign disease, now making us run around behind electron microscopy and genetics, considering the many advances that have happened in this field. So let me not stand between you and the speaker. Dr. Sudha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the nice introduction. At the outset, I would like to congratulate Dr. Kalaivani for conducting this program in a very systematic way. So now I'd move on with my presentation. Kalaivani, my slides, I need to visualize it.
You can click onto your slides, ma'am. It is there.
Projection, I can, okay.
Okay, I'll just project the slide.
So it's visible now?
That's visible.
Okay, the next 20 minutes, I'll be covering on post-infections glomerulonephritis and what is beyond that. So post-infections glomerulonephritis is an immune-mediated glomerular injury that occurs as a result of host response to an extrarenal infection. Until date, post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis is one of the most common cause of the acute glomerulonephritis in children. And we need to understand that it has a varied clinical spectrum. It can present as just an asymptomatic microscopic hematuria, which can be an incidental finding to rapidly proliferating glomerulonephritis. So now there is a changing trend. What was called before was post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. That is, the glomerulonephritis preceding streptococcal infection. The most common age group is the pediatric age group with a very good outcome. But currently, the terminology is slightly changed, and this is more related to the adult thing. And it was initially called the infection-related glomerulonephritis, which includes post-infectious glomerulonephritis, and if the preceding infection is streptococcus, it is termed as post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, and in its absence, it is called as post-infectious glomerulonephritis. In adults, generally the outcome is not very favorable as in children due to the associated comorbid conditions like immunocompromised states, diabetes, etc. Now going on to my first patient. Here is an 8-year-old school-going boy who presented to the OPD with the following complaints of reduced and cola-colored urine for 2 days, swelling of face for 1 day. 10 days prior, he had sore throat, which settled in 3 days without any intervention. No pointers for secondary glomerulonephritis, no past history of similar illness, no family history of renal disease or deafness. On examination, he was comfortable, he was hypertensive, had puffy face, pedal edema, had a normal throat, had elevated JVP, normal heart sounds, had a clear lungs with no basal crackles. On evaluation, we could see that he had proteinuria, plenty of RBCs and RBC casts. His counts were normal, and his urea was slightly elevated, and creatinine also was elevated, and potassium was towards high normal range. His albumin was normal, his complements were decreased, and his ASO titers were increased. His X-ray chest showed no cardiomegaly with mild light pleural fluid and an essentially normal ultrasonogram. Kalai, am I audible? So what is your diagnosis here? Is 8 years boy with acute symptoms, edema with signs of fluid overload, hypertension, hematuria, proteinuria, AKI, and he has elevated ASO and low complements. So it is very clear from this that he was suffering from post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. So how did the case evolve? So this is how he presented on day 1, which we've already discussed. And here we advised him bed rest, salt and potassium restricted diet, fluid restriction, and we treated with antibiotics, furosemide, as well as antihypertensives for day 2 to day 4. And then subsequently his hematuria cleared, his urine output improved, his diuretics were stopped, and there was no edema. By day 5, it resolved. And in day 6, his creatinine also normalized, his hypertension resolved, and hence the antihypertensives were stopped, and he was discharged. And by 6 weeks, his C3 normalized. So coming on to the clinical course of PSGN, the median age of presentation is in childhood between 6 to 8 years, and a preceding infection of the respiratory tract, usually a pharyngitis or of the skin infection, is identified in majority of the cases. However, we need to remember that subclinical cases also occur. The triad of edema, hematuria, and hypertension is classic for post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. But we also need to remember at times it can present with pulmonary edema and hypertensive encephalopathy. There are 3 phases of the disease which have been identified. One is the latent phase, where it lasts around 10 to 14 days after the infection. And then comes the acute and then the recovery phase in 4 weeks. In acute phase, you have the edema as well as the hypertension, which are present over 2 weeks. And then we have the hematuria, which is present, and then over 4 weeks kind of resolves the macroscopic hematuria. But the microscopic hematuria, it persists for around 12 to 18 months. The proteinuria also recovers in around 4 weeks. And the C3, which is depressed, is present, it remains on the lower normal range for 4 to 6 weeks, and then it normalizes. So coming on to the prognosis, a 12 to 17-year follow-up study of 534 children and adults in a Trinidad study showed complete recovery in 96.5% of the patients. In a Japanese study, they followed 138 children with PSGN, and none developed renal insufficiency. All had normal serum complements within 12 weeks, resolution of proteinuria within 3 years, and hematuria within 4 years. Studies reporting children followed 10 to 20 years after acute PSGN showed that approximately 20% of the patients have abnormal urine analysis, but the incidence of azotemia is less than 1%. So, in summing up, the overall prognosis of acute post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis is excellent for children. So now what is beyond PIGN? So let's see. This is case 2. A 7-year-old Master X was born to non-consanguineous parents, presented to us with edema for 1 week in April 2015. On examination, he had edema and he was hypertensive. Now, the investigations here showed proteinuria, RBCs. His creatinine was normal, but here the serum albumin was low and cholesterol was high, which was towards the nephrotic picture, and his complements were low. So what is the difference between the investigations of the previous case and this case? Here, the creatinine is normal, and here he has a nephrotic picture. So with this, with the nephrotic picture, we thought there is something more, and we further evaluated him. And here the C4 also was within the normal limits. His ANCA, ANA, and anti-dsDNA were negative. And we proceeded with a renal biopsy because of the nephrotic syndrome. So what did the renal biopsy show? His light microscopy showed 6/38 global sclerosis, enlarged glomeruli with lobular accentuation, and double contours in glomerular basement membrane, and 3+ positivity for C3 in the immunofluorescence. And in the electron microscopy, there were focally abundant mesangial granular dense deposits, subendothelial, subepithelial, as well as intramembranous deposits. And all this pointed out towards a dense deposit disease. So we further evaluated him, and we did a C3 nephritic factor, which was elevated, and the CFF gene did not show any significant variation. So after literature search, we advised plasma exchange and immunosuppressive therapy at that time. But the patient was lost for follow-up, again followed up with us in September 2018. But this time he presented with anasarca, compromising respiration, hypertension with pericardial fluid. Now, how to treat? So we did extensive literature search at that time, and we also got expert opinion, and we initiated him on mycophenolate, steroids, and also gave him supportive care. And here is the course of the patient in the last 2 years. Here we could see that his creatinine kind of stabilized, and his serum albumin also showed a steadily increasing trend, and currently it is 3.5. His cholesterol was slightly elevated, but better to what was before. His urine albumin also, it was showing an improving trend. As you could see in the RBCs, initially there were 35 to 40, and currently there's no RBCs. So initially he was started with mycophenolate, 2 mg per kg of prednisolone antihypertensives. Slowly his steroids were tapered, and then finally, now he's only on mycophenolate and antihypertensives. So he has showed some response to the mycophenolate, and he's currently under remission with the eGFR of 66. So this is my patient, third patient. So 7-year-old female, born to non-consanguineous parents, presented to us with the following complaints from May 2020. That is, she presented with 10 weeks of cola-colored urine. So how did this case evolve? Initially in February 2020, she presented with fever for 4 days, sore throat for 4 days, treated with amoxicillin, and it resolved. Then subsequently in March, she developed edema, followed by cola-colored urine for 1 day. She was normotensive at that time. Her C3 was normal. Her urine albumin was 4+, filled full of RBCs. Her eGFR was 70. Serum albumin was low. ASO was elevated. ANA was negative. And she was initiated on oral steroids elsewhere. So how does this child differ from the other 2 patients? Here you could see that she is normotensive. Her C3 is also normal, but here she has proteinuria as well as she has RBCs. And serum albumin is low and eGFR is decreased. So she is a mixture of the first 2 patients. So then she was advised renal biopsy, but she did not go to any doctor, and her edema resolved, but a cola-colored urine persisted. So because the cola-colored urine persisted, she presented to us in May 2020. And at this point of time, she had no edema. She was normotensive. Urine albumin showed 4+ albumin and filled full of RBCs. eGFR continued to be in the same range of 70. But now here the serum albumin had marginally improved to 2.9, but her C3 was in the low normal range, but it was within the normal range. So since she had an atypical course, we proceeded with a renal biopsy, which showed endocapillary glomerulonephritis with 2/17 cellular crescents consistent with infection-related glomerulonephritis. We had sent an electron microscopy, and the electron microscopy showed subepithelial immune complex deposits, which also was consistent with infection-related glomerulonephritis. So at this point, the patient was shifted to Pune because they were living in Pune, and the patient was transferred to KEM under the care of Dr. Jyoti Sharma. And there they further took up the patient and followed them. And at that point, the urine protein creatinine ratio was 9. The RBCs were plenty. She had mild edema. Her C3 was still normal, but within the low normal range. She was initiated on oral steroids, mycophenolate, as well as ACI. In October 20, that is the current scenario is she has no edema. She's normotensive. EGFR is increased, and it is now 121. Her urine protein creatinine ratio has reduced to 3. RBCs is also come down, and it is around 15 to 20, and the serum albumin is improved markedly to 3.4. So this is her light microscopy and immune fluorescence. And this was her electron microscopy picture. Now, what could this be? She presented like post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis with a high ASO titer and throat infection, but she had a very prolonged course, and even now she's on medications, and it has been around 8 months, but her biopsy was suggestive of infection-related GN, and even we had proceeded with the electron microscopy, which also was showing an infection-related GN, and now with 7 to 8 months with treatment, the disease is still active. So here we should consider the diagnosis of a C3 glomerulonephritis. So now why this presentation at all? To stress on the fact that all post-infectious glomerulonephritis we think are not PIGN. A few slides on C3 glomerulopathy. The C3 glomerulopathies are a group of rare kidney disease characterized by complement dysregulation, which occurs in the fluid phase and glomerular microenvironment. This results in prominent C3 deposition in the kidney, which in the absence or near absence of immunoglobulin deposits in a patient with classic clinical features of GN is the single most diagnostic criterion. There are two major subgroups. One is the dense deposit disease, and the other is the C3 GN. They both have overlapping clinical and pathological features suggestive of a disease continuum. So the major underlying defect in C3 GN is the excessive activation of the alternate complement pathway. There are various mutations or there are circulating autoantibodies, which results in the loss of control of the complement alternate pathway C3 convertase. So the major mechanisms which are involved in this are the autoantibodies stabilizing the decay of the alternate pathway C3 convertase, which is the C3 nephritic factor. Then we have the CFH mutations or the CFH autoantibody, which results in the loss of function and thereby impaired regulation of the decay of the alternate complement pathway C3 convertase, as well as the C3 and the CFB mutations resulting in an extremely stable alternate complement pathway C3 convertase resistant to the decay. So all this results in excessive production and glomerular accumulation of the C3 split products. And this is the baseline mechanism for the C3 glomerulopathy. The conditions such as post-infectious glomerulonephritis cannot be differentiated by C3GN just by a renal biopsy alone, which can confound early diagnosis and treatment, which is very evident from the third patient which we saw. And there's no disease-specific treatment available, although immunosuppressive agents and terminal complement pathway blockers are helpful in some patients. But unfortunately, there's no treatment which is universally effective or curative. In aggregate, with limited data which is available on the renal transplantation, this points to a high risk of disease recurrence in both DDD and C3GN. So just a quick look at this slide. So here these are the complementary regulatory proteins and the complements. Now, when there is usually, this is in a good balance. But in case of an infection, this balance is tilted. So once this balance is tilted, we have all the problems, and the alternate complement pathway is getting activated. And during recovery, this comes into a good balance. So this is generally seen in a post-rectal glomerulonephritis. But what happens in an atypical post-infectious GN? Here you have the autoantibodies, you have the mutant complement regulatory proteins, and when there is an infection, the balance gets tilted. And once the balance gets tilted, sometimes there is a slow recovery, but at times the balance is always tilted, as seen in the C3 GN. Coming on to the management of C3 glomerulopathy, which has been published in a recent Kidney International article. So the first important thing is, once you suspect a C3 GN, always it's good to rule out a post-infectious glomerulonephritis. Then we do the extensive complement workup if it is available. It would help us in the future, or when the child goes into an end-stage renal disease, and when we plan for a transplantation. And in case of subacute or acute deterioration of the serum creatinine or proteinuria, we need to consider a repeat renal biopsy. And not all C3 glomerulonephritis requires an aggressive management. Remember this. Whenever the proteinuria is less than 1 to 1.5 grams per day, or whenever there's a stable creatinine, just an ACI or an ARB is considered, and we need to monitor for any acute deterioration. But if the child is having a frank nephrotic picture, or the serum creatinine is high, then we can consider immunomodulatory treatments, like the first line now, which is considered, is the mycophenolate and the corticosteroids for a period of over 12 to 18 months. And the second line of agents are the anti-C5 and other anti-complement therapy, which are still under trial. So what is the evidence? So this is an interesting study. Here they've retrospectively reviewed 33 children with post-infectious glomerulonephritis diagnosed between 1985 and 2010 who underwent renal biopsy due to their unusual course. And then of them, eight of them were reclassified into C3 glomerulopathy based on the current classification criteria. So their result supports the hypothesis that PIGN and C3 glomerulopathy form a disease spectrum and have a different long-term clinical implications and management strategies. So summarizing my presentation, post-infectious glomerulonephritis is the leading cause of acute nephritis in children associated with transient complement activation. Its clinical features overlap considerably with those of C3 glomerulopathy, a severe chronic condition. Subepithelial humps are characteristic of post-infectious glomerulonephritis, but also seen in C3 glomerulopathy makes the diagnosis very difficult. Post-infectious glomerulonephritis is benign, but 50% of the C3 glomerulopathy progress to end-stage renal disease. So the key here is high index of suspicion and appropriate follow-up. And it's very important to watch for the red alert signs. So remember the red alerts: persistent gross hematuria, persistent proteinuria, persistent hypoalbuminemia, persistent hypocomplementemia, and progressive renal decline. Thank you.
Edwin, sir.
Thank you, Sudha. That was an excellent overview of the subject, and you addressed the very pertinent issues. Shall we take the questions at the end? Because we don't have any questions. Only one question has come up as of now. Shall we wait for the others to post the questions? Sorry, Kalai, I'm not able to hear you.
We'll take up the questions towards the end, sir.
Yeah,
the next
fine.
talk is yours.
Yes.
The next talk is by Dr. Edwin Fernando. He doesn't require any introduction, and he is the chairperson of the day. I call upon Dr. Edwin Fernando to present his case on childhood membranous nephropathy. Over to you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Kalivani, and thank you once again for the kind introduction and the opportunity to speak in this forum. I shall be talking today on childhood membranous nephropathy. And I shall begin by saying it's not just a disease for adults. So what is membranous nephropathy? Basically, it's a uniform GBM thickening with little or no cellular proliferation or infiltration. So it could be primary. This is a kidney-specific autoimmune glomerular disease that presents classically as proteinuria. Or you have a secondary cause where it's associated with other diseases like lupus or exposures to toxins, likely to recover once the cause is removed. And then you have this alloimmune type where there are antibodies that emerge to foreign antigens via the cationic bovine serum albumin in infants or to neutral endopeptidase in genetically deficient mothers who are alloimmunized during miscarriage. So if we look at the epidemiology of the disease, in the ISKDC series of 521 biopsies, membranous nephropathy was only about 1.5%. In another series in 1994, in children 1 to 12 years, it's only 1%. It increased to 22% in the age group 13 to 19. The median range age from 7 to 12, and there was no gender specificity noted. This is a very recent publication from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences Pathology Department, where they looked into 216 patients with membranous nephropathy retrospectively, and 32 were pediatric, which accounts for about 15%. So 15% of membranous nephropathy was in the pediatric age group. Coming to some local data, thank you to Dr. Anila for this data. In an analysis of about 25,000 odd biopsies, 3,215 were membranous, out of which 139 were less than 18 years, which accounts for about 0.54% of all biopsies. And 4.3% of all membranous nephropathy was the pediatric age group. This is data from China, again published recently. 7,000 odd children biopsies were looked into. Membranous nephropathy accounted for about 6%. So let's see how membranous nephropathy has evolved so far. From 1960, when it was initially described, and then the antigen for membranous nephropathy remained very elusive. There were some putative antigens. Then the neutral endopeptidase antigen was described, then the plateau-wire antigen was described. Then we had this genome-wide association studies, and plenty of other antigens like the PLA2R epitope, exhaustocin, NEL, SEMA3B, etc. So this follows what is known as the Moore's law. That is, every 2 years there is a doubling of antigens in membranous nephropathy. So what exactly is the pathogenesis? This is characterized by glomerular subepithelial IgG deposits. So basically it is an in situ formation of immune deposits, whether either endogenous or exogenous, which is activated by complement, the membrane attack complex insertion into the podocyte membrane, even in small quantities, triggers cell damage in the absence of inflammation. Coming to alloimmune membranous nephropathy, podocyte neutral endopeptidase and alloimmune membranous nephropathy. Basically, these are antibodies to the neutral endopeptidase who originate in women who genetically lack this NEP due to truncating mutations in the MME gene coding for NEP. So immunization happens during pregnancy when the mother's immune system is first exposed to NEP, strongly expressed by the placental cells and fetal cells entering the mother's blood. And from the 18th week of gestation, maternal antibodies of the IgG class are actively transported across the placenta to the fetus, where they bind to this NEP antigen expressed on the podocytes. So basically, it is a mother who has got truncating mutations. They become NEP deficient, and then they develop antibodies, and then the infant born with membranous nephropathy, born with this antigen antibody complex, develops membranous nephropathy. So what happens to this group of people? A majority after birth renal failure nephrotic syndrome rapidly improve in all children with the disappearance of the child's blood or maternal IgG. However, there have been case reports where persistent renal failure was found despite exchange transfusions, and this anti-NEP IgG1 was found responsible for the disease. The mothers had very high titers, etc. The second type is the BSA, the bovine serum albumin, which is a planted antigen. The cow's milk is a major source of BSA in young children. The antigen charge is a key factor for disease induction. Natural BSA is predominantly neutral. So what happens in children, the cationic nature of antigen in children is probably because of the food processing technique, intestinal microbiota, and frequent episodes of gastroenteritis in children that could lead to pathological modifications of the BSA. So basically, it's positively charged cationic BSA bind to the anionic glomerular capillary wall because of some electrostatic interactions. Normally, this should be endocytosed in the podocytes, but since this is not happening, they serve as a target for circulating antibodies. So this happens only in children. Why? Because in adults, BSA is more neutral. It fails to bind to the anionic glomerular capillary wall. While in children, the BSA is more cationic. It binds to the glomerular capillary wall. Why? Because more intact BSA enters the intestinal circulation during infancy before the GIT has matured and its barrier function has been established. And this explains why it's common in children. Coming to primary membranous nephropathy, way back in 1959, this was the Hayman's nephritis model. People were searching for an antigen for this disease for long. So this was an active membranous nephropathy model and a Hayman's nephritis model and a passive model where immune deposits are formed in situ as a result of the antibodies binding to the intrinsic glomerular antigen. So these are the various antigens that are implicated in primary membranous nephropathy, PLA2R, which is found in adults, and also a sizable number of children. The thrombospondin associated one, the NEL, the neural epidermal growth factor. This is not identified in the pediatric membranous nephropathy. And more recently, what is identified in the pediatric PLA2R negative membranous nephropathy is an antigen called semaphorin 3b, which I shall be talking about a little later. So right from 1959, the antigen remained elusive, and it was in 2009 in the seminal paper published in NEJ that Lawrence Beck and David Salant identified this 125 kilodalton antigen called the M-type phospholipase receptor A2. And they also did the tissue staining for this and found that this was present nearly about 70 to 80% of membranous nephropathy. However, in the pediatric membranous nephropathy, the sensitivity is only about 45%. So it's less prevalent with more diverse etiologies, according to this particular paper. And two other workers also showed that younger than 10, no PLA2R positive patients were seen. So they concluded that it was less associated in childhood idiopathic membranous nephropathy. However, it's more common in the adolescent and the preteen age group. Again, coming back to this study from All India Institute, where 32 pediatric patients were seen, here 44% prevalence of PLA2R based on tissue testing. So that means it's in adults, it's about 70 to 75%. In pediatrics, it's nearly about 44%. So this is a study from PGI where they looked into 5 pediatric membranous nephropathies. All 5 had PLA2R positive. Here, the titers were significantly lower than in adults. This is likely related to the steroid trial given to all pediatric patients before a biopsy. Probably they related that the steroids could have reduced the levels of the titers. This is a Chinese cohort where they compared adult and pediatric glomerular deposits and found that PLA2R positive staining in adolescent patients with idiopathic membranous nephropathy is similar to adults. The majority of young children with idiopathic membranous nephropathy was negative in very young children, suggesting a different etiology. Now, anti-PLA2R has been detected in the mother's breast milk. So this could be absorbed by the infant's underlying GAT. So membranous nephropathy adult mother who becomes pregnant, I think we are bound to check the anti-PLA2R on these levels. And then if the titers are high, we have to counsel the mother that these antibodies could be transferred transplacentally to their infants. Sanjeev Sethi, in a very recent publication, discovered this semaphorin 3 is a secreted protein with a 500 amino acid domain and detected in the endothelial cells, podocytes, and tubular epithelial cells. The SEMA3B regulates the slit diaphragm proteins such as podocin and decreases its interaction with CD2 associated protein and nephrin. And this also induces podocyte apoptosis. This function of the SEMA3B in the kidneys is not very clear. So, using a technique of laser microdissection and mass spectrometry, they showed that semaphorin 3B defines a distinct type of membranous nephropathy that's predominantly present in the pediatric patients. So in their study, they had 72% of patients had the semaphorin 3B associated staining. The average age, even in the patients who developed the disease in the adults, were much lower than the usual primary membranous age group. So it is very clear that this semaphorin 3B positivity is a distinct type of disease predominantly present in pediatric membranous nephropathy patients. This is the thrombospondin transmembrane protein, which is found in malignancy in adults. It's not of much significance in adolescents and pediatric age group. They looked into the IHC characteristics and serological characterization of membranous nephropathy in children and adults. It was found that 12 children with membranous nephropathy and in 5 renal biopsies were analyzed for all the antigens, and 6 were PLA2R antibody positive. 2 were PLAR positive and 3 were PLA2R negative. So the important observation here is that every child with the second child with the membranous nephropathy had a primary disease. Except for newborns, NEP may not play a central role. Western blot and IFT are more sensitive than ELISA, and pathogenesis of the PLA2R negative antibody patients remains unclear. These patients seem to have a better prognosis. This is a long-term renal survival and related risk factors for primary membranous nephropathy in 217 Chinese children. The 5-year mortality was about 90, the survival was 95.3, and 10-year was 67.8. More the proteinuria, more was the worse was the prognosis. Now coming quickly to secondary membranous nephropathy, this is the frequency of distribution of primary and secondary causes of membranous nephropathy. This is in adults, where it is predominantly primary. And here, the secondary causes are nearly about 24% compared to the primary, which is only about 45%. And among the secondary causes well known in children are lupus and hepatitis B. Secondary membranous nephropathy more common in children, 75% of children with membranous nephropathy versus 25% in adults. Hepatitis B associated membranous nephropathy, the HBe antigen has been demonstrated in the glomerulus. Now, 90% of these patients have detectable HBe antigen, and 95% of these patients have measurable circulating HBe antigen. And in South Africa, when they introduced the hepatitis B vaccine in their expanded program of immunization, it was found that it reduced the hospital incidence of HBV-associated membranous nephropathy over 6 years. Pediatric lupus, nearly about 82% of 44 children with lupus nephritis, 30% is class 5. Class 5 lupus need not have the characteristic serological findings of ANA positivity or hypocomplementemia. The classical findings of secondary lupus, secondary to membranous nephropathy, secondary to lupus is all well described. Mercury-induced membranous nephropathy, again, contact with mercury containing pills, accidental ingestion, skin lightening cream, hair dyeing agents, etc. The urinary mercury levels could be high, and deposits are mainly of IgG1 subclass. And we have had some reports from our part of the country. This is from traditional Indian medicines from the Apollo group at Chennai. And this is from JIPMER group, Dr. Srijit's group. And this is one of our own patients who developed deep insulin-induced membranous nephropathy. Some more research, overproduction of these mitochondrial fission proteins has been demonstrated in children, and one particular protein called DRP1 has been found, increased expression has been found in glomerular membranous nephropathy. Pathological significance is not clear. However, What is important, what is of interest is DRP1 inhibitors are promising agents for Alzheimer's disease and Huntington's chorea, whether one such DRP1 inhibitor will be in the spectrum to treat patients with membranous nephropathy, we do not. Coming to renal biopsy, basically differentiate between primary and secondary. Primary is strictly a subepithelial deposit with IgG and IgG4, while secondary membranous nephropathy, you could have IgG1 and G2, and subepithelial, mesangial, and extraglomerular deposits. You can find tubular reticular inclusions in lupus patients. This is the pathognomonic silver stain showing the spikes of basement membrane projecting from the outer surface of the GBM, and the immunofluorescence showing fine granular IgG, C3, PLA2R positivity, and also C5b9. And this is the electron microscopy that shows the discontinuous electron-dense deposits representing aggregates of PLA2R, anti-PLA2R immune complexes formed in situ along the outer surface of the glomerular capillary wall beneath the layer. Clinical features, 40 to 75% present with nephrotic syndrome. Microscopic hematuria could be found in the majority. Macroscopic hematuria has also been described in about 40% of a particular series. So the difference primarily between adult and children is more often present in hematuria accompanying the proteinuria. Hypertension and thromboembolic events are much less common. Renal functions is almost always normal at presentation. Spontaneous remission described in about 75%. Progression to ESRD is rare, and severe cases might progress in the absence of treatment. And it was found that only 0.4% of children on dialysis and 0.5% of children with CKD had membranous nephropathy. 17.6% progressed to chronic renal insufficiency. How do you manage? Diagnostic evaluation includes workup with the urine analysis, look for secondary causes, renal biopsy in patients more than 12. The challenges in the treatment are infrequent occurrence of the disease, frequent varying means of presentation, lack of RCTs and hard evidence, and inconsistent treatment response. So whenever you're trying to deal with membranous nephropathy, we want to eliminate environmental factors, reduction of autoantibodies, inhibition of the complement activation, and the protection of the podocyte. This is the KDIGO guidelines for immunosuppression. Proteinuria more than 5 grams or remains 50% above baseline. Severe disabling or life-threatening complications. Somebody has a thromboembolic complication, straight away you have to start immunosuppression. Or an unexplained rise in creatinine by 30% within 6 to 12 months from the time of diagnosis. This is the Cure Glomerulopathy Network cohort, again a recent publication in Kidney International, where they looked into what was a pattern of treatments of the clinicians in various glomerular diseases. So this is a Cure GN study which looked into the membranous nephropathy and found that 37 children were there in the cohort of membranous nephropathy. And what was very striking was most of the care providers were not aware of or lacked confidence in the current membranous nephropathy KDIGO guidelines. So the treatment patterns observed in this cohort might critically inform the drafting of planned updates to KDIGO guidelines. This KDIGO last guidelines came in 2012. The next one is expected anytime, and this has to be taken into account. So in the PLA2R era, the algorithm for a membranous nephropathy would be childhood or adolescence with SRNS, biopsy shows membranous, tissue PLA2R positive, measure the PLA2R antibody. If the PLA2R antibody is positive, suppose you have a thromboembolic complication, patient is anticoagulated, you can't do a biopsy, you can straight away do a PLA2R antibody. Then there's a presumptive diagnosis of membranous nephropathy. If it's absent, then you will have to just observe supportive therapy, the immunosuppression. If it is low, then again you'll have to wait and watch. In case the antibody level is high, there's some problem with this. Okay, basically it tells you that if If the antibody titers are high, then you'll have to go for immunosuppression if there's a nephrotic range proteinuria. And this PLA2R antibody could also mean that we could prognosticate based on the value of the anti-PLA antibody. It correlates with the urine output and disease activity, protein output and disease activity. They predict the outcome and they predict the time to attain remission. So this could be a useful biomarker for patients with membranous nephropathy. Steroid monotherapy, largely unknown. In a small series, about 50% of patients did not respond to steroids, or there was a complete or partial response to steroids. Still, we could miss membranous nephropathy, because if 50% of children are going to respond to steroids, then you would not do a biopsy on a child. So it is possible that we are still missing membranous nephropathy, and we are assuming that this is MCN because they respond to steroids. So these are the various studies in pediatric membranous nephropathy. And what is striking, depressing to note is the persistent disease in a very high population, very high percentage of patients. Alkylating agents have been the cornerstone of therapy. The dose of cyclophosphamide used in this study, a cumulative dose of 168 milligrams, which is within the safe limit from gonadal toxicity. Rituximab has been used in children. There's been no RCT. Safety profile is not very clear. Of course, it's been tried in frequently relapsing and steroid-dependent nephrotic syndrome. Dosing or the frequency has not been studied. Long-term safety is again not studied. These are some case reports of idiopathic membranous nephropathy in adolescents treated with rituximab, where you're depleting the B cells, and then you can see the proteinuria resolving. CNIs have been used. There is a dramatic response. However, the recurrence is quite fast. So, and remission was again achieved upon its reintroduction. So the clinician must weigh the well-known side effect profile of these agents and high risk of relapse against those of alternative immunosuppressive agents. Uncontrolled case series on mycophenolates are not very clear. And to highlight the differences between adult and pediatric membranous nephropathy, in pediatric, it is only less than 5%. In adolescents, 5 to 20%. Minority is idiopathic, so more of secondary. 45% have PLA2R positivity. Gender specificity is not very clear. Only 45% present as nephrotic syndrome. 70 to 90% could have hematuria. Hypertension is very less. Thromboembolic events less. Spontaneous remission is common. Progressive renal impairment is quite less. Mesangial deposits can be there up to 50%, and segmental distribution of deposits are occasional. So this is some genetic research work where GWAS studies have even studied in Indian children, Indian people, Indian patients were 114 patients who studied. These were the different gene polymorphisms that were studied. So what is clear is this offers new perspectives for genetic diagnosis of the disease and individualized treatment and prognosis, which could probably see the light of the day from a few years from now. So let me sum up. The podocyte autoantigens are the PLA2R, thrombospondin, AR, NEL, etc. Planting antigens are cationic BSA, complement system activation by the classical MBL and the alternative pathway, gene polymorphisms in all this that I have described. To conclude, membranous nephropathy is the histological description of an immune complex glomerulopathy resulting from in situ formation of antigen-antibody complexes in the subepithelial space, may present clinically in a child as asymptomatic proteinuria nephrotic syndrome. The major breakthrough was the understanding of the role of the M-type phospholipase receptor A2 receptor on the surface of the podocyte. Some young children with idiopathic membranous nephropathy may be the result of antibodies to BSA. Current treatment options favor alkylating agents with alternate day steroids. CNIs likely have a role as well. We don't have much RCTs because the incidence of the disease is quite poor, small, so we need RCTs in the field of pediatric nephropathy. And membranous nephropathy is not just a disease of adults. We must pass through the darkness to reach the light. We have seen much light on the progress in membranous nephropathy. Probably a more active biopsy policy would detect more membranous nephropathy in the pediatric age group as well. Thank you very much for the patient listening.
Thank you so much, sir. Has got very little knowledge on membranous nephropathy. Thank you for enlightening us. It was an excellent talk. Edwin, sir, would you like to invite the next speaker?
Yes, sure. It's my proud privilege to introduce to you Dr. Ranjit Tergonkar, who's a pediatrician and done a fellowship in the ISPN. He's a senior advisor in pediatrics and pediatric nephrology with the INHS Ashwini at Mumbai. He's had a PhD done at the Department of Pediatrics in All India Institute, New Delhi. Has specific academic interest in CACUT, UTI, VUR, bladder bowel dysfunction, and renal genetics. And he's been commended by the Chief of Naval Staff for his excellent services in the Navy. The floor is yours, Dr. Ranjit. He will be talking on...
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yes, Dr. Ranjit, you can go on.
Thank you so much. Can I start?
Yeah, you can, sir.
Audible?
Like your voice is little breaking, but then in case if your voice is little breaking, just put down your use.
I think I'm audible now.
Yes, fine.
Yeah,
that's fine.
audible.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Edwin. Thank you, Dr. Kalaivani, Dr. Sudha, Namalwar sir, letting me to speak here. And without further delay, I'll start. The concept of what is hereditary nephritis. Because at first glance, very often we don't hear this description dated today, but it's a disease which has a long history. And it started way back in the 18th century, in the 19th century, when Bright described this condition of dropsy, which is actually edema, coagulable urine, which is proteinuria, and renal disease. And then there was a family in which 11 out of 17 members were described with nephritis. And then more and more families started getting described. Now, this treatise in the 19th century, where it is very clear that at that time of science, it was not very clear as to whether the damage to the kidney is immune mediated or it's structural. And that's why there was a little bit of confusion over the years. In 1902, this very important family was described by Guthrie, who had idiopathic, congenital, hereditary, and family hematuria. This family was followed up over a period of time, and the final report came in 1927 by Dr. Alport, where he described deafness, more severe involvement by males. Then in the 1950s came, then the term Alport syndrome was coined by Williamson. Then the GWAS studies gave us the locus on X chromosome, since it was expected to be an X-linked disorder in 1989. So this is just some, interesting reading that, Guthrie recognized the services of Dr. Archibald Garrett, who will speak later. And he also said that, he also suggested way back in 1902 that the blood vessel walls may be involved in some ways. This is the paper by Dr. Alport, where he described, in fact, used the familial or congenital nephritis. He talked about deafness. He talked about more severe involvement in the male members of the family. The only thing which may have been a little off is that he was trying to associate it with streptococcal disease, which is quite understandable in that state of science. This is when the word Alport syndrome was suggested, because the disease was not demystified. Now, 1970s, another kind of disease came into description, where asymptomatic college student was found to have microscopic hematuria on a routine checkup. All investigation was normal. And when they looked up the family, they said that they found several members of the family who were affected. Renal biopsy, light microscopy did not show anything more than red blood cells in the tubules. But when they performed electron microscopy, what they saw was that there was thinning of the glomerular basement membrane. These are markers they had introduced, and they could see that the basement membrane is much thinner than 300 nanometers. So they also reported some holes in the glomerular basement membrane. So at this time, it was very clear that the basement membrane seemed to be the culprit in what was known as hereditary nephritis. So we'll come to some important components of the basement membrane. So this basement membrane is quite unique because it is actually the fusion of two basement membranes. It's biologically quite active. It is thicker than the other basement membranes of the body. It should be at least 250 nanometers in adults and 180 nanometers in children. So this is how it is, this cartoon shows the four important components. This is type 4 collagen. This is laminin, which is almost like, holding hands in a line. And on the other hand, it is tethering the podocytes. We have this dumbbell-shaped molecule called nidogen. And the fourth are the heparan sulfate proteoglycans, which are closer to the endothelial part of the basement membrane. So this is not just a structural story, it's also a functional story. All these molecules are talking to each other, but this crosstalk is not understood by the and it is said that systems biology has actually confused us more than given us answers. Coming to type 4 collagen, we can see that it consists of three strands of the protein, the three strands of the alpha strain. There is a non-collagenous domain at which they are all stapled together and then zipped together to form a single monomer. And then 4 monomers get together to form a tetramer. With development, what we see is that the immature membrane, glomerular basement membrane, contains alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha 1, alpha 4, alpha 5 with maturity. Now this alpha 3, 4, 5 configuration is resistant to damage by the endopeptidases, which were described by Dr. Edwin, and that's ability to the podocyte. This is laminin. This has got an alpha, beta, and gamma chain all wound together at one end and open at the other end. So the end which is closed helps in tethering the podocytes, and the other ends help it to attach to other molecules of laminin as well as other molecules. And it is important for the structural integrity of the basement membrane. Again, with development, there is a slight change from laminin alpha 1, beta 1, gamma 1 to alpha 5, beta 2, gamma 1, which has biological significance later. This is the nido molecule, and its importance is not yet understood fully, but it seems to be a part of basement membranes all over the body. The heparan sulfate proteoglycans proteins are to give the negative charge and keep the basement membrane anionic so that albumin is repelled and it does not appear. And the glycosaminoglycans also change with development. From perlecan and collagen 18, it becomes an agarine-dominated atmosphere, ecosystem. So in a nutshell, we have these four important players: collagen 4, laminin, nidogen, and agarine. So coming to Alport syndrome, it's known to be a progressive hereditary renal disease accompanied by sensory neural hearing loss and other ocular abnormalities. There are pathogenic variations in the COL4A3, COL4A4, and COL4A5 genes. For the sake of simplicity, I'll be calling them mutations. It is said to be present in 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 10,000 population, so we must be missing a large number of cases, and it accounts for as much as 12.9% of ESRD in children. Most of Alport syndrome is X-linked, but we also get recessive and autosomal recessive and dominant forms of the disorder. Now, why is it caused? It is because of multiple reasons. One of them is altered signaling between the mutated collagen chains and the podocyte. And because the podocyte senses an abnormal chain, it makes an attempt to repair the chain, but it in turn secretes a more abnormal collagen, and it sets about a vicious cycle. There is also secretion of genes which cause renal fibrosis, and this adds to the renal damage. And the role of ACE inhibitors, besides coming down on proteinuria, also are anti-inflammatory drugs. The collagen 4 is important to give mechanical stability, and in the absence of this, the body loses podocytes very rapidly. There is also disruption of the podocyte foot process. It does not get developed in the first place. Injuries transmitted to healthy podocyte mesenchymal transformations, which again adds to the fibrosis. So what we had from a happy glomerular basement membrane, we have a basement membrane where the foot processes have got effaced. They're mixed up. The slit diaphragms are not seen. The basement membrane, which was normal in thickness, has become varied, thick at places, thin at other places. There are these thin lines, which we call lamellations, which have developed. And of course, it cannot perform the function of glomerular filtration as effectively. Clinical features of Alport syndrome. It is usually discovered on the evaluation of hematuria or sometimes proteinuria, and a large number of individuals develop end-stage renal disease, especially males, by the age of 40 years. Now, what we can see is that females seem to be affected less seriously, but they cannot be called carriers because they are affected to a certain extent. Ocular manifestations can be subtle and asymptomatic, and that's why whenever we get a patient with Alport syndrome, a detailed eye evaluation is considered. Now, there are gender differences in Alport syndrome, but not in autosomal recessive Alport syndrome. It behaves similar to X-linked Alport syndrome. Dominant Alport syndrome, again, has no gender differences, but the disease is somewhat milder. The proteinuria appears much later, the end-stage renal disease appears much later, and sometimes it gets confused for steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome. What do we get on renal biopsy? The light microscopy findings are usually non-specific. On electron microscopy, in mild cases, we just get diffuse thinning of the glomerular basement membrane, or early in the course of the disease, we get it that way. Later in the course of the disease, we get a picture of irregular thickening and thinning, as well as basement membrane, sometimes called a basket weave appearance. The immunofluorescence have looked at staining for 5-collagen in the kidney as well as in the skin. It's important to understand that autosomal recessive and dominant forms of the disorders are caused by variations in the alpha 3 and 4 chains, and that's why this technique is not useful for them. Even in the X-linked forms of the disorders, this can be seen in only 80% of the cases because only truncating mutations cause an absence of the alpha 5 chain. So the presence of an alpha 5 chain does not rule out Alport syndrome. So this is the thin glomerular basement membrane as described, and this is thickening, thinning, and lamellation of the basement membrane. Immunofluorescence in a normal glomerulus shows the alpha 5 chain shows staining of the Bowman's capsule as well as the endothelium. In an X-linked male Alport syndrome, we see that nothing stains. In an X-linked female, we see that there is diffuse staining. This is because of the random lionization and inactivation of the X chromosome. And this is an autosomal recessive Alport syndrome where the alpha 5 chain has stained in the Bowman's capsule. This has happened because it consists of alpha 5-6 chains, and in the glomerulus, we don't see this. Similarly, in the skin, in an Alport male X-linked, we find that there is no staining. In a female, we find that there is diffuse staining. In a normal control, we see a diffuse staining everywhere, and this is alpha 1 as a control. Now, there are some conditions which can mimic Alport syndrome. There can be variations in CD151 and DDR1, which are very well within the pathway of interaction of the collagen 4, and that's why they produce diseases which can resemble. There can be energy defects like mitochondrial myopathies. There can be defects in the cytoskeletal proteins. There can be mechanotransduction defects like the Alstom syndrome. And just to complete the list, we can have tubular disorders. So genetic diagnosis is the gold standard, but what we have to understand is that we have to test not only the A3, A4, and A5 genes, but we also the 3, 5, and 6 genes. I'm sorry, but we must also look for the other genes which can produce disorders which are similar to Alport syndrome. We need to include the intron exon boundaries, and that's why conventional Sanger sequencing will fall short. It is too meticulous a process, so we require next-gen sequencing. So if we do not find any variation in next-gen sequencing, we should look for copy number variations. So this is something practitioners must get into the habit that if nothing is found, we must talk to the lab, we must talk to the bioinformatician and say that please look for copy number variations within the NGS data. There are tools which can help us to do that. But still, if we find nothing, we can do a reverse transcriptase PCR of the mRNA. A logical question is, where do we get this mRNA? This mRNA can be found in the kidney biopsy specimens. There are protocols by which RNA can be extracted from these specimens. Of course, this is done on a research basis, and I'm sure it is not available commercially. There is good genotype-phenotype correlation with very mild disease and missense variation and severe disease and deletions, but this is found only in the XLAS males. The females and the autosomal forms of the disorder do not have such a tight genotype-phenotype correlation. This is possibly because of the presence of some modifier genes. Now, this list of genes, as we can see, are the usual suspects in steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome. So you can very well have one or two variations in the Alport genes in conjunction with these variations in these genes, which are together acting to cause the disease which we are seeing in our patient. So the line between nephritis and nephrotic syndrome is gradually getting blurred. So genetic testing is the method of diagnosis, but it has its advantages as well as limitations. The advantages are that firstly, we can make a diagnosis early and treat early and also do reproductive counseling. But there are limitations because sometimes we get variations which are difficult to interpret and we require expert help in interpretation of these variations. And also these individuals can be discriminated against by the insurance companies. Is thin glomerular basement membrane nephropathy a separate entity? Most probably not. It seems to be merging into the spectrum of Alport syndrome. So we can be quite sure that if we find an asymptomatic individual with a variation suggesting X-linked Alport syndrome, we need to follow up this person very carefully, even maybe start preemptive treatment. But if there are heterozygous pathogenic variations, there again these individuals need to be followed up. So it is a matter of time. So this is the classification of Alport syndrome. We have X-linked, autosomal forms, and we can also get digenic forms where there are two different variations in two different genes which are acting in tandem. The clinical picture can be mixed in this. So these are the diagnostic criteria. We must have persistent hematuria for 3 months as a primary or a mandatory feature, and one secondary feature or two accessory features for the diagnosis of Alport syndrome. Why is this important? Because very often we get children with hematuria which is glomerular in origin, and we are not able to find any cause. The C3 levels are normal. So if there is a genetic background or if there are clinical findings which are suggesting Alport syndrome, we should start with genetic testing. And if there is no such background, we should start with kidney biopsy because IgA nephropathy can also present similar to Alport syndrome. What is the treatment? ACE inhibition or ERBs are the treatment for Alport syndrome. This is a very elegant data from the European Alport registry, where they showed that in more than 250 affected people, that where you do not take any treatment, the trajectory to disease is very, very steep. If you take treatment at the stage of proteinuria, it is less steep. If you start at microalbuminuria, it is even less steep. And if you start treatment at diagnosis, that is genetic diagnosis, when there is no hematuria or microalbuminuria, the prognosis is excellent. Similarly, there is sibling data where the elder sibling unfortunately took the brunt because the disease was not known, but the younger sibling benefited from early diagnosis and therapy and showed a more gentle curve towards end-stage renal disease. Now, even if there are heterozygous mutations, starting therapy with ACE ERBs can be useful because this very small observational study showed that the stage of CKD, in fact, even reversed in a large number of patients, and they remained free of end-stage renal disease. ACE or ERB, this question is always doubtful, and this small study of 27 patients say that the effects are largely similar. So usually ACE inhibitors are preferred. We are more comfortable using them in the pediatric age group. And finally, the randomized control trial, which was known as the Early Protect Alport study. Unfortunately, this trial had aimed to enroll 80 patients, but they could get in only 66 patients, and only 22 could actually be randomized, whereas the other arm was an open treatment arm, which was compared with the historical cohort. The good thing was that there was very few adverse effects of serious adverse effects which were attributable to the ACE inhibitor, and they could be mitigated by adjusting the dose. The trajectory to renal deterioration was much gentler in the patients who were treated, but this effect was not found to be statistically significant. So the safety of ACE inhibitors is proven. The efficacy has strong support, but it is not irrefutable evidence. There was some enthusiasm for cyclosporin, but because of temporary effect and nephrotoxicity, this interest has dwindled. So how do we monitor children with Alport syndrome? If the diagnosis has been established genetically for X-linked Alport syndrome in a male, ACE inhibitors should be started immediately. These guidelines had come in actually before the randomized control trial had been published. But even in patients with microalbuminuria, it's good to consider ACE inhibitors. And if there is progressive proteinuria, in addition to ACE inhibitors, we should look at controlling lipids. We should look at controlling blood pressure. We should look at the alternate or additional renoprotective agents like pyracalcitol. There are newer therapies over the horizon, chaperone molecules which stabilize the collagen 4, stem cell-based therapies which can replenish the podocytes, and of course, therapy for renal fibrosis. There are two agents which are undergoing randomized control trials. One is the silencing microRNA 21, and the other is bardoxolone. If these agents are proven, they may have benefit in even other forms of renal disease. Now, other than Alport syndrome, there are other entities which are related. This is again a basopathy, Hannack syndrome, where there is a defect in the alpha-1 collagen, and it manifests in the form of hereditary angiopathy with nephropathy, aneurysm, and muscle cramps. So what we get is cystic kidney disease, we get recurrent strokes, we get tortuosity of the retinal vessels, and a moth-eaten appearance of the glomerular basement membrane should we perform a renal biopsy. Pearson syndrome, we all know, is a form of congenital SRNS because of a mutation in LAM2. This is where the laminin becomes important because the mature laminin 521 cannot be formed, and that's why we get bad nephrotic syndrome, microchoria because this protein is also present in the eyes, and there can be neurodevelopmental issues also. The Neil-Patella syndrome is actually was not considered to be a basopathy, but it has been found that there is a moth-eaten appearance of the basement membrane on electron microscopy. Then there are the non-muscle myosin disorders. There were 5 disorders which were described, but they are now all subsumed under one disease called the MYH9 related disease, where there is a defect in the non-muscle myosin type 2A, which causes manifestations which are very similar to Alport syndrome. So we get hematuria, we get proteinuria, we get deafness. In addition, we also get thrombocytopenia, and also we get defects in the polymorphs. Now, this defect is from a protein which is present in almost all cells. So what are we trying to say here? We are trying to say here that hereditary nephritis was attributed to the basement membrane, but now we get basopathies which do not manifest as nephritis. In fact, they manifest very often as SRNS. And we get hereditary nephritis, which is not basement membrane in origin. So what happens to this entity called hereditary nephritis? And anecdotally, we can say that maybe the answer lies between the duality of the philosophies of the two great doctors, Dr. Osler, who believed in understanding disease from its clinical manifestation, and Dr. Garrod, who believed in chemical individuality. Dr. Garrod discovered alkaptonuria. So one was considered the father of modern medicine, one the father of molecular medicine. So what has happened to hereditary nephritis? From the concept of dry disease, we are coming to the concept of basopathy. From hereditary nephritis or benign hematuria, we are coming to a concept of a spectrum of disorders. We are coming from renal biopsy to pedigree and genetic studies. We are moving from no treatment or only supportive treatment to early genetic diagnosis and treatment. And I think that is the way forward for all of us. Thank you very much. This is a cartoon from the Early Protect Alport study where they say that the kidney is like a washing machine and Alport syndrome is like having holes in your washing machine because of which your clothes land up in the drain pipe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ranjit. That was an excellent disposition of the subject. We can take some questions now. There's one gentleman. Yeah. There's one gentleman from Spain who wanted a Spanish translation of our talk.
Spanish question.
So, yeah. So I just apologize to him that we don't have such facility. Probably the next question, I think Sudha can take that. Kalivani, can you read that question?
Yeah, sure, sir. To Dr. Sudha, should complement pathway testing be routine, at least in bad IRGN, just not to miss mimicus? The C3 nephritic factor testing available in India? Dr. Sudha? Dr. Sudha, you're there online? I think Dr. Sudha has got disconnected. Like once she is back, we'll take up her questions. Till then, we'll move on to the next questions. Is that fine with you, sir?
Yeah, no problem. I think the
next question is...
that is also for Sudha only.
Yeah, that's for Sudha. And the fourth question is for you, sir. Any PLA2 are tighter cutoff for high versus low in pediatrics treatment?
Yeah, we don't have much data on that. That's from Dr. Saugat Dasgupta from SSKM. I invite you to read the paper from PGH Chandigarh on this, published in 2015, where they have taken a cutoff level which is very arbitrary and then tried to define what is high and low. So what they found out was, even in the patients who are PLA2R tissue positive, the PLA2R titer in the serum was relatively low. So the what is the cutoff that you need to take? Nobody is very clear on that. Probably we need to keep doing this on large scale so that we can come to some consensus on the cutoffs.
Okay. Okay, fine, sir. Thank you. The next question is again to Dr. Edwin. How do we check for antibodies to BSA or NEP in clinical practice?
Yeah, I don't think we I don't think we have the facility to check this right now. I checked out with a few laboratories whether they are doing this. So I don't think it's available right now.
Okay, okay, fine, sir. Like there is a small request. Can you please repeat the slides of summary of membranous nephropathy? Probably we can give the download links. They can have a look on that.
Fine, sure.
If you wanted to repeat, sir, I think it's going to be difficult for you again to go back to the slides and do it.
No, we can provide the link later.
Link later, yeah. The next question is to Dr. Ranjit. In Alport syndrome, deafness is from birth or develops afterwards, later in the life?
The registry data suggests that it does not develop at birth. It is usually detected later on in life, but it is also important that sometimes there may be the patient may be able to listen to speech frequencies, and the frequencies which are higher than the speech may not be heard. So we should look at picking up this deafness earlier. And whenever there is a patient with suspected Alport syndrome, we should not just take clinically, we should also ask for at least a pure tone or a play audiometry. Usually deafness is developed in most patients at the median age of about 25 years in the males. And about 90% would happen by 40 years.
Okay, okay, fine, sir.
Most Alports would reach ESRD by about 25 to 30. And as Dr. Ranjit clearly mentioned, that deafness may not be there for our usual conversation tones. So unless you do an audiogram, you can't pick up this high tone sensory neural deafness.
Okay. Okay, fine, sir. Thank you, Dr. Ranjit. The next question, I think it's open for all three of you. How glomerulonephritis or glomerulopathy would develop RPGN?
Okay, I'll take that. If you take a disease like infection-related GN, you can develop an RPGN by two mechanisms. One is a crescentic transformation. So when there are a lot of crescents are nothing but layers of cells that are laid down in the Bowman space because of a breach in the basement membrane. This is proliferation of parietal epithelial cell plus from some cells from the monocyte macrophage system. So these crescents could compress the glomerular capillary tuft, and this could lead to a reduction in the GFR. This is one mechanism. Without crescents also, somebody having an endocapillary proliferative glomerulonephritis like an infection-related GN, the endothelial swelling itself will reduce the filtering surface area, and this could lead to a reduction in GFR. So these two mechanisms could mean that there's a reduction in GFR. This is in an acute situation. Over long term, of course, a glomerular disease leads to activation of the TGF-beta, which is a very important fibrogenic cytokine. And this leads to interstitial fibrosis, IFTA, what we call as IFTA, interstitial fibrosis and tubular atrophy. And over a period of years, this could lead to CKD. But this question is on RPGN. So basically, it's crescent or just a very diffuse endocapillary proliferation. Both could cause.
Okay. The next question is, are you suggesting starting enalapril in Alports even without proteinuria? If not, what is the advantage of biopsy or genetic in Alports with only hematuria? Dr. Anjit.
Yeah, so there is, so as such, we don't have expert guidelines which have recommended that we start enalapril in absence of proteinuria, but we have high quality evidence which tells us that ACE inhibitors, in fact, the one which was used was ramipril, but it doesn't matter, we can use any of them. ACE inhibitors and herbs are quite safe. We start usually at a low dose and hike it gradually, so they are very safe in these children. And there are studies from the European registry over a long period of time which are observational, which say that over a large number of patients, which say that it actually mitigates renal failure, and the trajectory to end-stage renal disease is very, very gentle. Also, the Alport Early Protect trial showed that even prospectively, in that small number of data which we had, that these children who started ACE inhibitors, they fared much better than the other children who were not given ACE inhibitors. Only problem is that it did not reach statistical significance. Having said that, if with this data, I think anybody would prefer to start a drug which is safe, is to know that there's a fair chance that the child is going to be free from renal failure.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Ranjit. I think Dr. Sudha has rejoined again. We have two questions initially. Like, can I read out the questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Should complement pathway testing be a routine, at least in bad IRGN, just as not to miss the mimickers? Is C3 nephritic factor testing available in India?
Okay. C3 nephritic factor, we do it in the Quest laboratories, and when we had done it, they had actually sent the samples abroad and they got the reports done. And for the other question, for IRGN, I think most common in children is still PSGN. And if it's atypical, then the first thing which I would advise here would be the renal biopsy and the electron microscopy, because that's something which is more readily available and it is cost effective when compared to the complement assay. So it might give us an idea whether it's a triple T or a C3GN. Sometimes we may not be able to differentiate a C3GN from a PIGN, as I had explained in my third patient. But the complement pathways, if the patient is affordable and you think they can do it, then only I would suggest. So it depends on the case-to-case basis. Otherwise, I don't think it's possible for us to get it done for all patients.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sudha. And the next question is again to Dr. Sudha. Would you regularly do C3 nephritic factor? Is it readily available? I think you have already answered the question. Also, what does the electron deposits consist of?
Dr. Ranjit wants to say something.
Yeah. Actually, regarding the C3 nephritic factor, Dr. Pankaj Hari's lab in AIIMS, they're trying to set up this test. They've had a person tested, and if there is a patient who just cannot afford it, at least it just requires filling a form and registration and contacting their group. At least, at some point the results may be available.
Okay, so now it is readily available in India for testing. Fine. Thank you, Dr. Ranjit. The next question is again to Dr. Sudha. I'll just read out the question again. Do we regularly do C3 nephritic factor? Is it readily available? That is the first part of the question. And the next part is also, what does the electron dense deposits consist of in EM of C3G and triple D?
So C3 nephritic factor, I think we've already taken it up. And then C3G, they say there can be subepithelial or some endothelial deposits can be there. And in triple D, there are intramembranous deposits predominantly, and it also can have subepithelial and subendothelial. So it's always difficult for us to always differentiate triple D, triple D and the C3GN or the PIGN just with an electron microscopy, but there are these findings might help us.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sudha, for the clarity. I think the next question is, again, the question is not all that clear. In PSGN, anti-HT routinely used which one?
Sorry?
Probably in PSGN, antihypertensive drugs are used. Which one do you prefer? That is what the understanding of the question is.
Okay. So as far as the antihypertensives I prefer would be a calcium channel blocker, and PSDN being a very acute situation and where there already is an AKI, I generally do not prefer to use ACI or ARPs at that moment.
The next question is rather a comment, not a question. Excellent presentation by Dr. Ranjit. Open new horizons in understanding the pathophysiology and management. And the next question is, if in a case of IgA nephropathy, CON mutation is detected, how to interpret? Dr. Ranjit, the question is to Dr. Ranjit.
If it is a clear-cut case of IgA nephropathy, then in all probability it is better to not act on it, because if there is a case of IgA nephropathy, it is going to present in two ways. Either it's going to be recurrent hematuria without significant proteinuria, which is also the presentation of thin GBM disease, or as we knew it. If there is persistent proteinuria, in any case we are going to start ACE inhibitors. So there's nothing much more which we can do except maybe predictive testing, and genetic counseling can be quite complex in that situation. So I would rather not act on this this information and just continue ACE inhibition and treatment of IgA nephropathy as, depending on the stage of IgA nephropathy, whether or not immunosuppression is required. I think that, what do you say?
Yeah, that's fine. IgA deposits could be there. There's something called a lanthannic IgA nephropathy, where palindromic IgA, I must say, there are accidental deposits of IgA. So not all IgAs need to be treated aggressively. So even in an Alport, some IgA deposits could be there. So that doesn't make it IgA nephropathy. Probably it is only an Alport. Anyway, that is a very hypothetical situation that has been addressed.
That's true. Thank you, sir. Now, the next is, again, there is a comment asking for the summary of membranous nephropathy. The download links will be available soon. You can go through it. And the next question is regarding, they are asking about the composition of deposits in C3 glomerulonephritis. This is to Dr. Sudha or Dr. Edwin. Anyone can take up the question.
I think this must be regarding the electron dense deposits. So
yes,
what
electron dense deposits.
So it should be, what are the deposits consisted of? Are they made up of the complete components?
I think it's some osmophilic granules which I read through, but I'm not very sure. Edwin sir, can you help me out with that? This is what I went through, but...
Yeah, that is what it says. I'm also not very sure on that. Probably we could.
This is what
So the description of the dense deposit disease is ribbon-like intramembranous osmophilic electron dense deposit. But
so that's what they want to know. What it is made up of.
What it is made up of is that, again, they've done
osmophilic granules is what I know, but anything more to it?
the alternate complement phosphate component. So what is just before the terminal complex, those components come in.
So then it is mostly the C3 complement, C3 breakdown, that products, that is the main thing in a C3GN than the terminal pathway. So
yes.
I think there is a continuity of the same question. Is it like a complement or some immune complex like C3? I think Dr. Sudha has already answered the question. It is a breakdown of C3 complements. I think we are done with all the questions.
Right. Also, I mean, one does not really look at routinely the components of the electron dense deposits cannot be analyzed.
Correct.
We use the finding of the deposits, and we go more by the IF, whether we found immune deposits or not. And nowadays they are looking at C4B also for differentiating between the two forms of dense, C3 glomerulopathies.
And the important factor is and the important thing is by IF we have to have at least a 3+ granularity of the C3. Yes. So with that, then we proceed with the electron microscopy. So that is more important in diagnosis of a C3GN.
Yeah, that's true. The composition doesn't matter. The next is, we have a few more questions coming up.
So they're all very attentive.
Yeah, all are very attentive.
A lot of questions.
It is a comment. I think we are done with all the questions. Thank you so much for the extensive and elaborate talk. It was a good discussion on glomerular disease. Thank you, Dr. Edwin. Thank you, Dr. Sudha. Thank you, Dr. Ranjit. It was an excellent talk. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kalivani. Yeah. Thank you, Sudha. Thank you, Ranjit.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ranjit. Bye.
Bye.